I'd like to now ask whether the actual de-escalation techniques are embedded within the policy itself. And so I'm drawing your attention to, again, Exhibit 219, which is MPD Policy 5-304. And if you take a look at the section here that's been enlarged, de-escalation tactics include but are not limited to. If you would please just summarize for the jury the different bullets that you see here.
Yes, some of the bullets here for de-escalation tactics.
Sir, one moment. Oh. All right. Thank you. All right. Please resume.
Yes, some of the de-escalation tactics that are noted here include but are not limited to placing barriers between an uncooperative subject and an officer, communication from a safe position intended to gain the subject's compliance using verbal persuasion, advisements, or warnings, using verbal techniques to calm an agitated subject and promote rational decision-making, calling for additional resources to assist, including more officers, CIT officers, and officers equipped with less lethal tools.
And CIT officers are those who've been through the crisis intervention training course, is that correct?
That is correct.
And are Minneapolis police officers then at the training center taught different techniques on how to implement this policy?
That is correct.
Have you personally attended the training?
Yes, I have.
Did you find it useful?
I have.
And you could remove that. We've talked a little bit then about behavioral crises and identifying behavioral crises. How does the Minneapolis Police Department respond to persons in a behavioral crisis?
One of the first important things is obviously trying to get as much information prior to the call as possible. But as soon as officers at least have knowledge that this could be a potential situation with that caller, this de-escalation piece should kick in. And that they, while they may not know exactly what they're going to encounter when they arrive on the scene, this body of knowledge that they've been taught should at least be kind of forefront in terms of the different tools that they'll be using possibly to help de-escalate that situation.
What is an EDP? What is that acronym?
The acronym EDP is labeled through our Minneapolis Emergency Communications Center as a emotionally disturbed person. And so when our Minneapolis police officers receive a EDP call, that is prompting them that there's at least initial information that they're going to be responding to someone who may be in crisis.
And that's something that the officer would then be communicated by a dispatcher prior to going to the scene, correct?
That is correct.
However, when if that information is not imparted upon them, they make their own assessment at the scene as to whether the person could potentially be an EDP. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You indicated that the Minneapolis Police Department receives over 100,000 calls a year, calls for service. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have an idea of how many calls for service involve people in crisis?
I believe in 2019, Minneapolis police officers responded to about 4,500 of those signified as EDP calls. Yes.
Now, in terms of teaching officers how to recognize a person who may potentially be in crisis and therefore unable to comply with commands, you place these different signs into MPD policy.
That is correct.
And I'd like to direct your attention now to Exhibit 231 and ask that to be published. And this is 7-809, the crisis intervention policy. You say it begins here. Oops, sorry. But we'll go ahead and over to page 2. And I'd like to highlight, please, for the jury, the definition of a crisis. And again, in the definition of a crisis under MPD policy, generally speaking, we're talking about some of the same things that we saw before in the de-escalation policy. Is that right?
That is correct.
There can be mental illness. Is that right?
Yes.
Substance abuse can be a crisis or a barrier to communication, correct?
Yes.
And same with various stressors. Is that right?
Yes.
And then further, if you can emphasize the crisis intervention definition. And officers, when they either respond to an EDP call or are aware that the person may be in crisis, can attempt a crisis intervention method. Is that correct?
Yes.
And generally speaking, what is the officer supposed to do to a person in crisis?
It's an attempt to de-escalate that situation.
And the policy then of the Minneapolis Police Department in handling persons in crisis, if we could look at section 3 of the policy, would be the next page. Highlight Roman 3. Okay, in accordance with the Minneapolis Police Departmental policy, what are officers supposed to do? How are they supposed to handle encounters with individuals who are experiencing a crisis?
We really want to, again, we want to meet people where they are. We want to bring our values and our principles to those situations. We recognize that oftentimes people who are experiencing crisis, it is not something that they brought on themselves, but they're dealing with. And so there's a sense of dignity and respect that we should be honoring when we come to those calls. And so, as it's mentioned here, the values of protection, safety, and sanctity of life. Oftentimes, again, we are that first face of government that they're going to see. That may be 3 o'clock in the morning. And so we have to wear many hats, but we want to be respectful in that care that we're trying to provide for that individual.
And sometimes persons might be experiencing some sort of a breakdown that, you know, maybe they did partially bring upon themselves. Is that right?
That is correct.
And are those people still entitled to be treated in accordance with MPD policy?
Yes, they are.
And this policy, again, is imparted in training at the training center by that group. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, I'd like to, if you could take that down, please, talk to you a little bit about officers' role as first responders in terms of providing basic medical care. All right? And so, with that, can you tell the jury, are Minneapolis police officers trained to provide basic medical care?
Yes, we are.
Can you please describe what level? I'm aware there are various different levels of medical care that someone could be trained in.
So most of department members will have at least basic training in terms of first responder, the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, the effects of applying direct pressure on wounds to stop bleeding. Many of the things that we will respond to, perhaps just because we're closer to a call than perhaps our EMS or fire before they get there, and they obviously have a higher degree level of training. But the training that we have and that we receive, it's very vital because those seconds are vital. Our officers carry tourniquets. We respond to situations where members in our community will have gunshot wounds. And matter of fact, a couple of my officers a couple of weeks ago saved a young man who was shot in the femur and was bleeding profusely, but because they got there quickly, knew how to apply that tourniquet. Those are some of the basics. Baby not breathing calls. Our officers have saved the lives of children who've choked or what have you because they've applied or they've been able to help start emergency breathing for them. So those are some of the basic types of first aid that are chest compressions, those types of basic first aid. Yes.
And are officers then, specifically trained at the training center to provide this basic sort of first aid?
That is correct.
And does the Minneapolis Police Department have a policy regarding any duty that an officer would have to apply that training to a real-life situation?
Yes. We recognize, again, I mentioned that we are oftentimes going to be the first ones to respond to someone who needs medical attention, and so we absolutely have a duty to render that aid.
And that, of course, is in the policy and procedure manual, is that right?
Yes.
If I can display Exhibit 230, which is MPD Policy 7-350. Emergency medical response. And under Roman 1, you see that the purpose of the policy is to lay out in writing the roles and responsibilities of Minneapolis Police Department employees in incidents involving a medical emergency. Is that right?
Yes.
If we could take a look at the policy itself under Roman 2, does that explain what a Minneapolis police officer is supposed to do when they come upon a medical emergency or a medical emergency develops on a call?
Yes.
What are they supposed to do?
While awaiting EMS, MPD employees assisting an individual having an acute medical crisis shall provide any necessary first aid consistent with our MPD training as soon as practical.
And so then that presumes, of course, they're waiting for EMS or waiting for some kind of emergency services. Is that right?
That is correct.
So would it be fair to say that this policy then is in two parts? The officer has to request EMS or an ambulance, correct?
Yes.
And while waiting for the ambulance, they're required to provide what medical training and skills they have to attempt to save the person.
That is correct.
Are Minneapolis police officers provided naloxone or Narcan kits?
Yes, we are.
What are those?
It is basically a inhaler for community members who we may respond to have overdosed. It is to, if they've overdosed and are out, it is to give them that inhaler injection so that they can hopefully come to. And so it was a few years ago where, for the most part, our Minneapolis Fire Department were the ones that responded to overdose and carried the Narcan. Unfortunately, in our cities across the country saw an uptick in heroin and opioid overdoses. We had to make sure that we were, again, because we were oftentimes the first ones to come across these situations, we wanted to make sure that we were in service to our communities and making sure that if we could save lives, that we were equipping our folks with Narcan.
And a policy developed as a result of this, is that right?
That is correct.
If I can show you Exhibit 229, it's published at. Is this the Narcan policy 7-348?
That is correct, yes.
And our officers provided training in the administration of Narcan?
Yes.
Under appropriate circumstances?
Yes.
Okay. And now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the use of force. Does Minneapolis have a written policy governing proper and authorized use of force?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And is this generally covered in the 5-300 series of the Policy and Procedure Manual?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to discuss some of that manual with you and the policy with you at this time. If we could pull and display Exhibit 216. Under the purpose of the policy, which is 5-301, can you please read the first sentence under subparagraph A?
Yes. Sanctity of life and the protection of the public shall be the cornerstones of the MPD's use of force policy.
What does that mean?
Of all the things that we do as peace officers for the Minneapolis Police Department, and I mentioned the thousands of calls that our men and women respond to. It is my firm belief that the one singular incident we will be judged forever on will be our use of force. And so, while it is absolutely imperative that our officers go home at the end of their shift, we want to make sure and ensure that our community members go home too. And so sanctity of life is absolutely vital, that is the pillar for our use of force.
Has this generally always been the case with Minneapolis use of force policy?
It is not.
When did that change?
We implemented this particular in 2016.
Has the training and use of force and application of use of force policy been imparted, including this philosophy, onto police officers in training at the training center?
It certainly has, yes.
Does the policy itself define force? What is force?
Yes, it does.
If we can take a look at Exhibit 217, I'll publish that. If you'd highlight use of force. Generally speaking, what is force?
It can be any physical contact. It can be with a weapon. It could be with a vehicle. But it's any sort of physical contact that is more likely to render harm or injury to someone.
Is the use of restraint considered force?
That would be considered force.
And what type of force is authorized under departmental policy?
We under 609, we operate under the use of force, the Graham v. Connor statute, objectively reasonable force.
And if I could display Exhibit 217. Let's see. First, go back to 5-303. 5-303 authorizes force, is that right? And you mentioned 60906, state statute authorizing force under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
And the phrase that's used for the authorization of force is what type of force?
Reasonable.
And that force can be authorized under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
All right. So now if you would go to the next page, and let's talk about the circumstances under which a police officer is authorized properly to use force. If you highlight that. What are the circumstances under which an officer is authorized to use force?
An officer is authorized to use force effecting a lawful arrest, executing a legal process, enforcing an order of the court, and any other duties imposed upon that officer.
And that term reasonable force is further delineated in the policy, is that right?
Yes.
If we take a look at Exhibit 217, I believe under the definition, objectively reasonable force. Could you please read that definition?
Yes. The amount and type of force that would be considered rational and logical to an objective officer on the scene, supported by facts and circumstances known to an officer at the time the force was used.
Oh, you discussed a case, the Connor, right? The Connor factors. And I'd like you to, well, first of all, does the policy reference the Connor factors that you just mentioned?
Yes.
If you could display 217, page 2. And we have 3 bullet points here under the Connor factors. And that is the officer is supposed to look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And the 3 bullets here that the officer is supposed to consider are what?
The officer should consider the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, and whether he is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. And
fair to say these 3 different considerations are things that you can attribute to the subject, correct?
Yes.
That's the subject's conduct, not someone else's.
Yes.
And of course, it has to be judged by a reasonable police officer on the scene at the time, correct?
Yes.
Now, do you recall, and obviously you're here talking about what happened on May 25, 2020 involving George Floyd, Do you recall why the officers were responding to cup foods on that date? The original reason for the call?
The original reason for the call was a response regarding a counterfeit situation at the store at the intersection of 38th and Chicago.
In terms of the deployment of your resources at the Minneapolis Police Department and as chief, how do you rate, I guess, the severity of that offense, the seriousness of that offense?
It would probably not rise to the level of, and particularly in light of last year, the level of violent crime that we've experienced in the city, but we would certainly respond to it, but it would not rise to the level in terms of severity of the crime here.
In looking at the particular type of crime, is that one for which a suspect is typically taken into a custodial arrest?
Typically not.
And why is that?
If it's not a violent felony, we also, in coordination with our jail system and our courts, there's been a shift over the years to make sure that the individuals who are going to jail are those who, from a public safety standpoint, need to be at least in that facility in the Hennepin County Jail. And if we can properly identify and it's not a violent situation, we can always charge via complaint and other things. And so that's one of the reasons why.
You use the phrase, I guess, violent felony. What's the more important part, whether it's violent or whether it's a felony?
Well, violence.
Why is that?
Well, it can certainly endanger not only the officers but the community.
Where something that's merely labeled a felony may or may not require a full custodial arrest.
That is correct.
And are Minneapolis police officers trained in the use of force?
Yes.
In pre-service, in the academy, and also in post-service at the in-service training?
Yes.
And are officers taught the standard that force must be reasonable at the time it is applied?
Yes.
The entire time it's applied?
Yes.
Are officers taught the need to assess and reassess and reevaluate situations in the field?
Yes, we are.
Are you familiar with Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking model?
Yes.
How are you familiar with that?
It was something that I wanted to embark and make sure that it was part of our training curriculum that also includes the aspects of procedural justice. And procedural justice is really, it's actually research and evidence-based learning that has shown that if police departments treat people with respect, give them voice, establish neutral engagements, and build areas of trust, our communities are more likely to cooperate with us. We're likely to be seen more as legitimate. It is actually shown that our employees come to work, their wellness is better, and so this is very important work. And so it's part of that procedural justice I just mentioned, is part of that critical thinking in our training.
At this time, I'd ask to display only to the witness exhibit for identification 276. Sir, do you recognize exhibit 276 as being MPD's critical decision-making model?
Yes.
Offer exhibit 276.
Any objection? No objection. 276 is received.
Permission to publish. So we heard about the model, now we get to actually see it. And if you could enlarge the graphic, please. All right, so this is what the model looks like. It's sort of a wheel, is that right?
Yes.
And the first stage of the critical thinking model, or decision-making model, is information gathering.
Yes.
Explain that, please.
It's very vital. We rely upon trying to gather as much information as possible so that we can try our best to effectively go in, respond, and manage that situation. trying to gather as much information at the onset is very important, but we also need to make sure that we're continuing to try to gather as much information as we're dealing with the scene or the call.
I see the arrow points in two directions. In one, it points to the middle of the circle, voice, neutrality, respect, and trust. And the other arrow points to the threat or risk assessment. Let's talk about the middle of the circle first. Right? What is that middle circle supposed to be representing?
Well, that's the principles, really, of what continues to guide us. So, for example, information gathering, while we may associate it specifically with receiving a 911 call and the dispatcher giving us information, but information gathering could be that officers come across a call that they weren't dispatched to and they need to talk to a community member. If they don't treat that community member with respect or give them voice, it's likely that they will receive less information that will be less helpful in them resolving that call. So that voice, neutrality, respect, and trust, that has to guide and be a part of all of that critical decision-making model.
So let's go to the next step. The officers gathered some initial information, and now the officer is in a position to need to think about it or assess it. Is that right?
Yes.
And so the next step is the threat or risk assessment. Is there a difference between a threat and a risk?
There can be in terms of what is being played out at the time, and you're constantly evaluating that. And of course, the information that you're receiving, which may be fluid, is going to dictate that threat or risk. Yes.
And so then, once the officer has made an assessment of a threat or a risk, the next step, authority to act. What does that mean?
That may mean the officer now, based upon the information that they've received, evaluating that threat or risk, am I going to act? Is this going to be a physical arrest? Am I going to separate parties? Does this require a report? All of these things. So, but it's giving more information for the officer to guide he or she in terms of what is the next appropriate step they need to act and take.
And so, if we're to, at least to this point in the model, put a scenario into action, information gathering, the officer perceives that someone is approaching them with a weapon, like a bat, right? And so then they would reflect on that and determine whether or not this is a risk. It's a bat. Maybe the person is at a baseball game, or a threat. The bat is being brandished. Correct?
Yes.
Then after that, under authority to act, if they've determined that this in fact is a risk and that they're being threatened, they would look at the authority back to the MPD policy and procedural manual. Is that right?
Yes.
Under what is the use of force policy, what tools are available to me to respond here?
Yes.
Right? The next step then, after considering the authority to act, goals and actions. What is that?
The goals are, the officer is making an assessment. So with the authority to act, will an arrest resolve this situation? Will separating the two parties be enough? Is taking a report, will that be enough of a goal or an action? It may mean a combination of things. It may mean that I'm going to have to, or the officers are going to have to make an arrest, but we may need additional resources here because the situation is still could have the potential to not be stabilized. And so all of that is part of that goals and action.
And then to review and reassess, assuming that means exactly what it says. Exactly.
Yes. And information is going to flow, dynamics can change, and so it can be a constant just review and reassess the situation to make sure that we're trying to get to the best possible outcome in this peacefully and safely.
Because circumstances can change, the situation can change, correct?
Yes.
And force that might be appropriate at one moment might not be appropriate at a different moment, or more force might be needed at yet another point. Is that right?
Yes.
This particular critical thinking model, Exhibit 276, we see examples of this throughout training materials, that are provided by the trainers at the facility. Is that right?
Yes.
And why is that?
It's to really embed that knowledge that, we don't want to fall susceptible to kind of check the box training. This training is important for all of our officers to have a knowledge and understanding of, and that our community members can expect this to be consistent as they have encounters or engagements with our officers.
All right. If we could take that down, please, and I want to shift a little bit to talk about, we've talked about use of force and the policy. Does Minneapolis Police Department train its officers in specific defensive tactics?
Yes.
And where does that training occur?
That training occurs at our Special Operations Center.
And does the department provide training for officers in handling uncooperative individuals?
Yes.
Does the department provide training for handcuffing reluctant suspects?
Yes.
And when you provide the training, you're assuming you're taking someone into custody. Do you also teach officers their responsibilities, their personal responsibility with respect to the person they've just taken into custody?
Yes, we do.
And what responsibility does an officer have to a person they've taken into custody or restrained?
So the American policing profession, which I believe is the best in the world, and I will tell you why, and it's really two reasons.
Rephrase your question.
Yes, Your Honor. Sir, you have a responsibility, I guess, and that's imparted throughout officers in various forms of training as to what, once someone is in their custody.
Oh, yes. We have a duty of care, and so when someone is in our custody, regardless if they're a suspect, we have a obligation to make sure that we provide for their care.
Does that include people to whom defensive tactics are being applied?
Yes.
Why is that?
They are still in our they're still in our custody, and they have rights. And the humanity of this profession, we need to make sure that we're taking care of them.
So how often are officers required to participate in defensive tactics training?
It's usually a yearly, annual training.
Do you know that, when we're talking about the training and policies in effect on May 25, 2020, were neck restraints and chokeholds taught and authorized by MPD policy at the time?
At that time, yes.
And they were taught pursuant to the defensive tactics training as well?
Yes.
At this time, I'd like to publish Exhibit 224. Exhibit 224 showing MPD policy 5-311, use of restraints, neck restraints and chokeholds. You see a chokehold is considered a deadly force option, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. If you could go to the next page, please. Neck restraint, if you could highlight that portion from that down to unconscious neck restraint. Okay. There are various types of neck restraints that were authorized at the time, is that right?
Yes.
And neck restraint was defined as compressing one or both sides of a person's neck with an arm or a leg, is that right?
Yes.
But without applying any direct pressure to the trachea, the airway that needs to be protected?
Yes.
Right. And there were two types of neck restraints that were authorized: conscious neck restraint and unconscious neck restraint.
Yes.
And the objective of the unconscious neck restraint, the second one, would be to have the person actually pass out.
That is correct.
And under certain circumstances in which the officer was in fear of grave bodily harm or death, that would be authorized. Is that right?
Yes.
And conscious neck restraints were more with the neck restraint with the intent to control, but not to render the subject unconscious. Is that right?
Yes.
By applying light to moderate pressure. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And if you could go to Roman 2 on the same policy, highlight that. Okay. Conscious neck restraint can be used for someone who is actively resisting, correct?
Yes.
And an unconscious neck restraint could be used for a person who is exhibiting active aggression or to save a person's life. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Or in a subject who is exhibiting active resistance if lesser attempts would have or would likely to be ineffective. Is that right?
Yes.
But neck restraints were not to be used against persons who were merely passively resisting, correct?
That is correct.
All right. Now I'd like to draw your attention to May 25, 2020. Can you tell the jury when you first learned of the incident involving the defendant, officers Tao, Lane, and King, and George Floyd?
On Monday evening, around 9 p.m., back on May 25th, 2020, I received a call. I was at my residence, and I received a call from one of my, I believe it was a deputy chief, who had informed me that Minneapolis police officers had responded to 38th in Chicago, and while attempting to take someone into custody, which I learned now to be Mr. Floyd, they believed that he would not make it or survive, and so he was being transported via ambulance to, at that time, Hennepin County Medical Center. And while, at least the information I had that evening at 9 p.m., he at that time at least I was told was still alive, I decided to contact the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And they are a state agency that conducts our critical incidents. I deemed that this would be a critical incident, and it has been our protocol to alert them, and they would conduct that investigation. So I made that call to the BCA to have them start to conduct this critical incident.
Did you then proceed to City Hall?
I should also say that right after that call, I notified Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry to say that this is a situation we have at least right now, and that I would brief him as I received more information. I then proceeded to leave my residence, and I went directly to my office in City Hall.
When you arrived at City Hall, do you recall seeing any video images or footage of this event?
The first time that I saw a video of the event was after I was notified that Mr. Floyd was now deceased, and so I had asked my deputy chief to pull up knowing the area really well and knowing that there's usually a camera, a city-owned camera, at that location. I asked him to locate that video so that I could review it.
Okay. And that's what we would refer to as the milestone camera or milestone footage?
That is correct.
Okay. Did you watch the footage from the milestone camera that evening?
I did watch that.
Okay. Can you describe for the jury what you saw when you watched the footage?
When I first viewed this milestone video, what I was able to see, and I should just note that it was from a distance from where the officers were with Mr. Floyd, and so all I could really see were the back sides of the officers. There was also no audio to this milestone video, and so I viewed that video in its entirety, and quite frankly, there was really nothing in terms of the actions of at least, again, this non-audio video that really jumped out at me. After a few minutes, it seemed, a paramedic's vehicle pulled up to the scene, and it was at that time for the first time that I saw a glimpse of Mr. Floyd when paramedics placed his body on the gurney and transported him away from the scene. But that was really my first observation of that incident from that night.
At some point, did you become aware of another video that had been taken by a bystander?
Yes, probably close to midnight, a community member had contacted me and said, Chief, almost verbatim, but said, Chief, have you seen the video of your officer choking and killing that man at 38th in Chicago? And so once I heard that statement, I just knew it wasn't the same milestone camera video that I had saw. And eventually, within minutes after that, I saw for the first time what is now known as the bystander video.
Fair to say that this was a much closer video and it had audio?
Yes, this I was able to see the occurrence, see the officers involved. I was able to actually see Mr. Floyd. I was actually able to hear what was occurring, and I was also able to get a better understanding of the length of time, the duration of the call, the incident. Yes.
Now, prior to testifying today, have you now reviewed the bystander video, Facebook video in its entirety?
Yes, I have.
You've also reviewed and reviewed milestone footage?
Yes, I have.
And have you reviewed the body-worn camera footage worn by officers Tao, King, Lane, and the defendant?
Yes, I have.
Now, first, I want to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. Do you recognize Exhibit 17 to be an image taken from the bystander video that you reviewed?
Yes, I do.
Now, sir, based upon your review of all of the information that you just mentioned, do you believe that the defendant followed departmental policy 5-304 regarding de-escalation?
I absolutely do not agree with that.
And how so?
That action is not de-escalation. And when we talk about the framework of our sanctity of life, and when we talk about the principles and values that we have, that action goes contrary to what we're taught.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Well, we read the departmental policy on neck restraints. Is this a neck restraint?
The conscious neck restraint by policy mentions light to moderate pressure. When I look at Exhibit 17, and when I look at the facial expression of Mr. Floyd, that does not appear in any way, shape, or form that is light to moderate pressure.
So is it your belief then that this particular form of restraint, if that's what we'll call it, in fact violates departmental policy?
I absolutely agree that violates our policy.
Are you aware now that the defendant maintained this position on George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
I am aware of that.
I believe you testified that force has to be reasonable when it's applied at the beginning and through the entire encounter. Is that right?
That is correct.
Is what you see in Exhibit 17, in your opinion, within Minneapolis Police Departmental Policy 5-300, authorizing the use of reasonable force?
It is not.
And why not?
That is, it has to be objectively reasonable. We have to take into account circumstances, information, the threat to the officer, the threat to others, and the severity of that. So that is not part of our policy. That is not what we teach, and that should be condoned.
When do you believe, or do you have a belief as to when this restraint, the restraint on the ground that you viewed, should have stopped?
Once Mr. Floyd, and this is based on my viewing of the videos, once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, that should have stopped. There's an initial reasonableness in trying to just get him under control in the first few seconds, but once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, it is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Sir, based on your review of the video and based on your own experience and training as an MPD officer, did you see signs during the encounter that Mr. Floyd was exhibiting indicia of being in medical distress?
Yes. Yes.
And you saw at one point, I think you just testified, that Mr. Floyd was unresponsive.
That is correct.
And that officers, were you aware that officers couldn't find a pulse?
Could you repeat that, sir?
And were you aware that officers at the time of the restraint were unable to find a pulse?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And so stated.
I was aware that the officers were not able to find a pulse, yes.
Did you see the defendant or any of the officers attempt to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd?
I did not see any of the defendants try to attempt to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd.
The defendant did not try CPR. He did not start chest compressions.
Objection, argumentative, and leading.
Sustain is leading, rephrase.
Did you see them provide any medical attention?
I did not.
Then based on these observations, do you have an opinion as to whether the defendant violated MPD departmental policy 7-350 by failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd?
I agree that the defendant violated our policy in terms of rendering aid.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor. If you could please take me.
Mr. Nelson. You may.
Good afternoon, Chief Arredondo.
Good afternoon, Counselor.
Thank you for being here this afternoon and this morning.
Thank you.
A few follow-up questions for you regarding this incident. Your determinations today are in reference to employment policies and Mr. Chauvin's actions violating the departmental employment policies, correct?
That is correct.
Now, as the police chief, I assume that you're not out on the street day to day arresting people.
That is correct.
Can you just give me a general sense, when's the last time that you've actually, I don't mean to be dismissive, but actually arrested a suspect?
It's been many years, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Your role as the Minneapolis Police Chief is sort of grander in its scope, right? I mean,
It's large in context and the operations of the department, yes.
and part of that job is to be sort of aware of issues in policing, kind of policy changes, use of force changes. All of these things fall under the umbrella of your role as the chief. Agreed?
Yes.
And you're sort of the general in a sense, right? Formulating the plan for your police department.
And delegating some of those to our subject matter experts, yes.
Correct. When you talk about training of a police officer, you would also include the training that the Minneapolis Police Department goes through, but you may go to other trainings out of state, listen to speakers talking about issues that confront policing, right?
Yes.
As well as maybe a homicide detective will get permission to travel to an interviewing a suspect type of a training in some other state or location, right?
Yes.
And so there is a variability within the training depending upon your role as in the police department, right?
Yes.
So that you've got sort of your rank and file basic patrol officers, and they go through all of the trainings that you've described, the defensive tactics, medical assistance or basic medical training, crisis intervention, things that we've been talking about here today, right?
Yes.
And then the investigative type officers, they may go to some they have to go through that training, but they may go through some additional training in terms of how to interview suspects or how to properly collect evidence, et cetera, unique to their role, right?
Yes.
And then you as the police chief or those who are in the more management or administrative side of the police department, you go to the kind of the big picture training sometimes.
That's correct.
All right. So I want to review with you a few of the policies that we've already talked about today. If we could take this down for the moment, Your Honor. First of all, I'd like to show you what has been introduced as Exhibit 216, which is the use of force policy for the City of Minneapolis Police Department.
Yes.
We've discussed this. And I know that kind of what we did a little earlier is we kind of jumped around from part to part, but I'd like to walk through some of these issues in a little bit more linear fashion, if we could. So you've described under policy 5-301.01 that the Fourth Amendment's reasonableness standard applies to the use of force in Minneapolis, of the Minneapolis Police Department. Agreed?
Yes.
And that goes on to say that MPD employees shall only use the amount of force that is objectively reasonable, and it continues in light of the facts and circumstances known to that employee at the time the force is used. Correct?
Yes.
So the reasonableness standard, or the objectively reasonable standard, applies to the facts and circumstances that are known by the officer at the time the force is being used. Correct?
Yes.
Now, 5-302 gives some definitions in terms of the use of force, and it differentiates between active aggression and active resistance. Can you describe the difference between active aggression and active resistance?
Active aggression, behavior initiated by the subject that may or may not be in response to police efforts to bring the person into custody or control. The act of aggression when presenting behaviors that constitute an assault or in the circumstances reasonably indicate that an assault or an injury to any person is likely to occur at any moment. That's
So
for
let me-
active aggression.
Yep, let me just stop you there. That's active aggression. So that's where a suspect is essentially fighting with a police officer or doing something that is aggressive behaviorally speaking. Agreed?
Yes,
And that is aggressive in its nature.
yes.
Now, can you read active resistance?
Active resistance is a response to police efforts to bring a person into custody or control for detainment or arrest. Subject engages in active resistance when engaging in physical actions or verbal behavior reflecting an intention to make it more difficult for officers to achieve actual physical control.
So essentially, what we're talking about here is behavior that may or may not be physical in its nature that simply makes it harder for an officer to take a person into custody. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes that is maybe not trying to punch the officer, but pulling away or hiding his arms or doing something that just makes it more difficult physically, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it's, you're not going to take me alive, you dirty cop. You know, like they're saying something to prevent the officer from arresting.
Yes.
Right? So they're using their words, they're using their behaviors. Is it common, based upon your experience, for people to enjoy being taken into custody?
No.
Do people like to be arrested?
Typically not.
Right. And in your experience, is it common practice for people whom are being arrested to say things in an effort to try to get the officer to not arrest them?
That certainly occurs, yes.
Right. My mom is homesick, I need to get home to my kids. There may be words that they use to try to convince an officer to not arrest them, right?
Yes.
Now, you would also agree that there is a difference between being arrested and being detained. Agreed?
There can be,
Right.
yes.
So an officer in certain circumstances is permitted to expand the scope of the original intervention. Would you agree with that?
Objection vague.
You can restate.
Let me try. When an officer approaches a situation, and let's assume it's a relatively minor offense, is it possible that that minor offense can grow in its scope of investigation?
Yes.
And it's actually quite common for that to happen, correct?
Yes.
An officer makes a traffic stop for speeding or something like that, smells drugs in the car, searches the car, finds a large amount of drugs, finds guns, etc., right?
Yes.
So what starts out as a relatively minor incident, a traffic ticket, can turn into a felony arrest, correct?
It could.
And that, again, happens quite regularly.
Yes.
So when an officer, well, let me back up a second. You would agree that being a police officer is a pretty dangerous profession.
There are inherent dangers with it.
I've never had to get in a fight with anybody in my life, in my job, right? But in your job, it's probably more probable that that will happen. Would you
Yes.
agree with that? Now, talking about the use of force, when an officer approaches a motor vehicle, is that considered to be one of the most dangerous initiations of contact between an officer and a citizen?
I don't have the exact statistics on it. It's certainly an encounter that officers are certainly more heightened. I know that domestic response calls can also have a sense of heightened awareness for officers, but it's certainly something, a traffic stop certainly raises an awareness for officers, yes, for their safety.
And that's because that's that suspect's sort of space, right? The officer doesn't know what's in the car or in the apartment during a domestic situation. You're walking into someone else's territory, so to speak, right?
Yes.
Right. And so there could be guns, there could be knives, there could be any number of instruments that could bring harm to a police officer, right?
There's that potential.
Now, obviously, there's tens of thousands of traffic stops, and there's not every traffic stop turns violent. I'm not suggesting that, but that does happen regularly. Agreed? That traffic stops turn violent.
Yes, they can.
So when we're talking about the use of force policy under 5-301.01, the last sentence that wasn't read before is the force used shall be consistent with current MPD training. Agreed?
Yes.
Now there's a difference between a policy change and like a best practice change. Would you agree with that?
Can you clarify?
Sure. So there are certain times where the policy, it's with respect to the use of force, may specifically change to prohibit a particular style or use of force, right?
Yes.
So thinking about in the old days, officers used to wear like weighted gloves to make their punches more effective, right?
Yes.
The policy changed and prohibited that, correct?
Yes.
And then there's a difference between, say, the evolution of defensive tactics. Would you agree with that? I mean, the defensive tactics training you received in 1989 is much different than the defensive tactics training that's taught now, right?
Yes.
And I believe it was maybe 15 years ago that the Minneapolis Police Department started moving towards more body weight control, sort of this jujitsu training, as opposed to physically striking people to gain compliance.
And are you referencing policy or training?
Training,
I believe so.
about 10, 15 years ago,
Yes.
agreed? And that was sort of highlighting the evolution, as you kind of described it in your direct examination, of policing since you've become a police officer. That's
Yes.
one way it's evolved.
Yes.
And when something changes per policy, can't wear weighted gloves anymore, for example, that's it, no more. Agreed?
Yes, I agree, yes.
But if the policy, if training, for example, evolves into a best practice, it doesn't prevent an officer from learning a technique he learned earlier in his career. It just may not be the best practice anymore.
So I pause just to, when you say that they're learning something, but if it's not in alignment with our policy, then that would not be prohibited, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Let me try to explain. Like, so if an officer was trained in a particular handcuffing technique, and then they go to their defensive tactics training and they say, this is a better way to handcuff a suspect, it's not a policy change, it's just a best practice change. And they can still use the old way they did it.
It would, Counselor, it would have to be something that the training staff would have to, not just an officer saying, I want to do it this way, and I mean, it's something that would have to be authorized through our training staff. Yes.
So we could talk about that kind of thing with the training, the use of force defensive tactics training, right? That would be the better place to talk, better people to talk to about that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Now, when we're talking about active aggression and active resistance, sometimes those two things are happening simultaneously. Agreed?
It can be, yes.
Go back to... So now we were talking then about, again, the Graham versus Connor case and how that is incorporated into the Minneapolis Police Department policy. And I'm showing you Exhibit 217 now. It should be up in front of you. What we're basically talking about was a United States Supreme Court decision that outlined the objectively reasonable use of force standard, right?
Yes.
And Graham versus Connor is not limited to those three factors that you were read before, right? The Graham versus Connor analysis.
Yes, correct.
those are three that are kind of listed, but ultimately it's not an all-inclusive list of considerations for the reasonableness of the use of force. Agreed?
That would be my understanding, yes.
And in fact, what the policy reads is that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of the reasonable officer on the scene rather than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight, right?
Yes.
So we're looking at it in the instant and the moment based upon the objective standard, right?
Yes.
Now the policy also includes that the calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation, right?
Yes.
And that's because when officers go to a situation, kind of like what we talked about before, what can be initially very minor can grow into something major. Agreed?
Yes.
Now to show you Exhibit 219. You read a part of 5-304, which is threatening the use of force and de-escalation. And I want to talk to you a little bit about de-escalation. Have you heard the term, sometimes you have to escalate to de-escalate? You ever heard that phrase?
I have not heard that.
Okay. So in here you talk about, or the policy talks about, that officers shall consider verbally announcing their intent to use force, including displaying an authorized weapon as a threat of force, right? So sometimes an officer has to take out his gun, say, hey, I mean, that's a use of force in that instance, right?
Yes.
And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to use force. It's a pretty clear indication that force could be used when you have a gun pointing at you. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
But other things such as chemical irritants or tasers, it's not limited to just the firearm, right?
Yes.
And so sometimes what an officer has to do is command the presence, right? They have to take control of the situation.
Yes.
And sometimes that's not particularly attractive, is it?
Could you explain?
Sure. The use of force is not something that people like to watch generally, right?
Objection, speculation, and argument.
Sustained.
Would you agree that the use of force is not an attractive notion?
I would say that use of force is something that most officers would rather not use. Yes.
Right. And you described in your direct examination how the single greatest way that the Minneapolis Police Department could be judged is based upon how the public perceives its use of force.
Yes.
Right? So it has a tendency to garner a lot of attention.
It can.
So much so that citizens have become more prone to record observed interactions with police, right?
Yes.
Something that you didn't have to deal with back in 1989, right?
Yes.
So essentially what this policy 5-304 in terms of threatening the use of force, it's contained within this de-escalation concept, right? So sometimes you have to display a weapon to gain command so that you can de-escalate, right?
Yes.
Now, when we're talking about, is it fair to say that pretty much every single one of these use of force of policies contains some phrase, if reasonable or if practical? There's limitations on the use of force, right?
Yes, there are limitations. Yes.
And it's situation by situation, right?
Yes.
And then again, if we go back and look at the language of the Graham versus Connor and the policy that's contained by Minneapolis Police Department, it's the use of force has no precise, objective, singular rule. It's different in every case.
Yes.
So for example, in the de-escalation policy 5-304B1, de-escalation is advisable when it is safe and feasible, correct?
Yes.
And sometimes de-escalation, again, includes the use of force, right? The use of force can be a de-escalation tactic.
Counselor, I was thinking of your example of displaying your weapon, and so I don't have a lot of knowledge in terms of physical force being used to actually de-escalate a situation, but the threatening use of force or threatening verbally, I'm more familiar with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, if we were to talk to the use of force or defensive tactics,
Objection, argumentative,
Overruled.
they would be the best source of that.
objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
Yes.
But the purpose of de-escalation, agreed, is to attempt to slow down or stabilize the situation so that more time, options, and resources become available to the officer.
Yes.
Basically, slow down, everybody kind of calm down, let's try to relax, right?
Yes.
But it's a lot more, the process of de-escalation is not just trying to talk somebody out of doing something. There are actions that are important, there may be reactions that are important, and the de-escalation policy includes some examples of those things, right?
Yes.
Such as placing barriers between an uncooperative subject and an officer.
Yes.
And sometimes those barriers are another officer, right?
Yes.
Containing a threat, right? I mean, that's one of the examples in policy.
Yes.
By containing a threat, that can include physically restraining someone so that they don't upset another person, right?
Yes.
Or cause another person to have a violent reaction towards them or officers, right?
Yes.
Moving from a position that exposes officers to potential threats to a safer position, right? So kind of retreating in certain circumstances.
Yes.
Reducing exposure to a potential threat using distance, cover, or concealment, right? So hiding, say, behind a squad car, right?
Yes.
Avoiding physical confrontation. That's probably a pretty big one, right?
Yes.
And using verbal techniques to calm an agitated subject or promote rational decision-making. That's kind of down towards the end.
Yes.
And lastly, calling additional resources, right?
Yes.
And we talked about Exhibit 230. Showing you Exhibit 230, which is the emergency medical response. You'd agree that the policy requires Minneapolis police employees to request an emergency medical service as soon as practical, right?
Yes.
If a person comes into contact having an acute medical crisis, and any delay in treatment could potentially aggravate the severity of the medical crisis, right?
Yes.
So sometimes officers will call for EMS, not thinking it's a major issue. When suddenly it becomes apparent, they can step up or request a quicker response from EMS, right?
Yes.
And that is something that an officer can do to ensure the medical treatment of the suspect that they have or the person that they're in contact with, right?
Counselor, to ensure, I'm sorry, to ensure,
Sorry, it's been a long week. to ensure the medical condition of the suspect, to help with that.
Yes.
Right. Get EMS there as quickly as is possible. Right?
Yes.
Now, we didn't talk about the maximal restraint technique. You're familiar with the policies surrounding that?
Yes.
I'm going to show to you what's been admitted as Exhibit 225. Can you describe what the maximal restraint technique is?
Yes, Counselor, the maximal restraint technique is, has often been referred to as the hobble. And that is it's a method of, if officers are dealing with typically a combative or aggressive person, in order to protect them or even property, it's placing, basically attaching a cord of the legs to the waist, so that the person, the individual, does not have free movement of their legs. So it's securing them, again, usually by their ankles. If you're prone, bringing that up to your waist and securing it. The maximal restraint technique, or the hobble, though, if it's used, a supervisor has to respond to the scene. You cannot transport anyone prone in that position due to the risks of the breathing. But that is the, Counselor, that would be my understanding of the MRT, or the maximal restraint technique.
So you talked a little bit in terms of the use of force, how officers are kind of reevaluating their use of force from time to time, right? They
Yes.
should be, at least, right? And so if officers decide to use the maximal restraint technique and then decide, hey, we know, and then later decide not to use it, right? That is kind of adjusting that use of force.
I would, Counselor, with some clarity, I don't know if that, what I mean by that is, if you were to have a person handcuffed and prone on their stomach on the ground and pavement, and you had two officers, let's say, securing their legs to the back of the waist, you in a way are still employing what that technique is about anyway. So there can be some variances to that.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
It does. So let's assume that you've got two officers pulling the legs forward, essentially employing that aversion, so to speak, of the maximal restraint. But then they release and they say, we're not gonna hobble this person. We're not gonna employ the MRT. You're going from a decision to employ that technique backwards down the continuum in terms of the use of force. Would you agree with that?
And Counselor, I just because these types of uses of force can be problematic in terms of there's a high risk to them. So meaning that if you're going to take that initiative to do that alternative version in the first place, you'd want to get a hold of a supervisor, because something could happen in terms of that person. And so
I'm not asking in terms of the policy. I'm asking in terms of sort of the use of force and the critical decision-making model, right? You described how the use of force, you have to go through this critical decision-making model. How much force am I going to use? And sometimes you have to back off the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes you have to go forward with the use of force, meaning you use even more force.
Yes.
Right? And it's this constant reevaluation. Agreed?
Yes.
And so when you have officers who make a decision that the facts and circumstances would warrant using the hobble device, but then later decide not to employ that device, that is that critical decision-making model in action. Agreed?
Yes.
And it would be a reduction in the use of force. It may still require supervisors to be on scene, policy-wise, but it is a reduction in the use of force. Agreed?
And Counselor, just, are we talking specifically the events of May 25th?
I'm talking
Or
generally.
In general, yes.
But you would agree ultimately that all of the Minneapolis Police Department policies relevant to the use of force, emergency medical response, emergency medical treatment, all of these policies are, by their very language, are situationally dependent, right? They all say if the circumstances allow, if time permits, if it's safe. They have a qualifier to them. Agreed?
Yes, I would agree with that.
I'm going to show you Exhibit 231. Which is at the bottom of Exhibit 231 is the crisis intervention policy. And the second page includes the definition. Could you read the entire definition of what a crisis is?
Yes. An event or situation where an individual's safety and health are threatened by behavioral health challenges to include mental illness, developmental disabilities, substance use, or overwhelming stressors. A crisis can involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the individual's current resources and coping mechanisms and may include unusual stress in his or her life that renders him or her unable to function as he or she normally would. The crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to himself, herself, and or others.
All right. So generally speaking, again, not relevant to the May 25th of 2020 incident. We'll get there in a minute. But when we talk about a general police response, sometimes the police may respond to something and the person they're dealing with is not in a crisis. Agreed?
Yes.
But other people may be perceiving what is happening and it could become a crisis to that person.
Objection.
If you could rephrase.
Sure. People who observe, would you say that people who observe police interactions with people, especially the more physical or use of force types, that could turn into a crisis for an observer?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustain is calling for speculation.
So in terms of the definition of crisis, a crisis may involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds that individual's current resources and coping mechanisms, right?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that you are the person with whom you are arresting or having contact with is going to be the person who will experience the crisis. Agreed?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
And Counselor, just respectfully, so you're saying that the person who's witnessing a situation with the officers, that situation may cause them to be in crisis?
Correct.
Could potentially.
Right. And the crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to him, her, or others. Right?
And Counselor, just this is the person who's watching this?
Right.
It could.
So people are watching what something that they appear to believe or they believe is wrong or contrary to police policy that may cause them to get upset, and that level of upsetment or that level of volatility may grow throughout the course of the interaction.
Objection irrelevant. Calls for speculation and beyond the scope.
Overruled. It's within the scope.
It could.
Because ultimately, part of the training that Minneapolis police officers have to go through is how to deal with crowds who observe police interactions, right?
Yes.
Crowds that may be upset with police interaction, right?
Yes.
I mean, there are classes through the training academy, there are classes through in-service specifically dealing with how to deal with crowd control, right?
Yes.
And all of this is to revert in part back to that de-escalation process as well, right?
Yes.
So part of it, as a crowd grows or becomes more upset, part of it is to try to de-escalate, which can involve trying to avoid a physical confrontation, right?
Yes, it could. Yes.
Trying to stay safe, concealed, and covered, right?
Yes.
Not yelling back at somebody, not engaging with them verbally, right?
Yes.
And sometimes when an officer tries to de-escalate a situation and someone is so upset, right? Sometimes they don't hear what the officer tells them. Would you agree with that?
Objection, speculation.
That calls for speculation. It is sustained.
Is it possible, generally speaking, that someone's own crisis may prevent them from hearing what an officer is telling them?
That could happen.
Hold on. The objection is sustained. The answer will be stricken.
So you testified that you've watched the body cameras, correct?
Yes.
Going to show you, I don't know. Mr. Slisher, this is exhibit 1008, which is a 10-second, approximately 5-second clip of Alexander King's body-worn camera. It's already and I gave you a copy of it.
Is this in evidence?
Not yet, no. I'm just telling you, first and foremost, that's what it is. I'm going to show you on your screen a short clip of a video to see if this would be contained in what you've watched. And I need to... You would agree that that appears to be taken from one of the officer's body cameras, May 25th, 2020, at approximately 20, 25, and 33 seconds.
Yes.
In, again, watching it without sound. Do you, at this point, did you see what appeared to be a reflection in the back of the squad car there?
Counselor, I did not.
Okay.
And it might just be because of the brevity of the video, but
Yeah, it's unfortunate. If you look in the upper left-hand corner at the bumper of the squad video.
The cursor to circle it for him.
I'm sorry?
Use the cursor, the stylus to...
Oh, sure. That's right. Forgot all this fancy technology here. You see the legs of someone reflecting?
yes.
And so you would agree that this appears to be a short clip from one of the officer's body-worn cameras on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
You've seen these before. You see what appears to be Mr. Floyd's arm there by the back of the squad car, right?
Yes.
So I would offer Exhibit 1008.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
1008 is received.
And if I may publish.
Come over here.
Up on the sidewalk.
Yeah, we need you to keep some distance. Everyone's coming.
Sorry, didn't mean to reply. Do you hear a voice say we've got an ambulance coming?
Yes.
if we could take that down. Now, policy 5-311. Let's talk a little bit about 5-311, which is the neck restraint policy. Get rid of this.
Council, would you stay there
For a second?
Sure.
Good time to break for our 20-minute mid-afternoon